This tiny solar panel runs my entire life now. It's a bitter joke, isn't it? I'm the man who was meant to power the entire world. I built a $4 billion green energy empire to save humanity from itself. Instead, I poisoned a town. I wasn't a villain driven by greed, I was a hero. And this is the story of how my good intentions paved a road straight to hell. My name is Phineas Thorne. 20 years ago, that name was spoken with reverence in the boardrooms of Silicon Valley and the halls of the United Nations. I was the chemical visionary, the eco-billionaire, the prophet of a clean energy future. Today, that name is a curse, whispered in hospital waiting rooms and screamed in courtrooms. The fortune I built, all $4 billion of it, is gone, vaporized to pay for a catastrophe I created. But this isn't a simple story of a rich man who got greedy and lost it all. It's far more dangerous than that. It's a story about a man who wanted to save the world so badly, he was willing to sacrifice a piece of it to do so. It didn't begin in a garage or on a factory floor. It began in the sterile, quiet halls of academia. I was a doctor of chemistry, a man who spent 2 decades of his life staring at molecular bonds and writing peer-reviewed papers that were read by, at most, 50 people. I was respected, tenured, and slowly dying of intellectual boredom and profound frustration. Every day I'd read the headlines: rising sea levels, record-breaking temperatures, an impending climate collapse. And every day I'd go to my lab and work on theories that might in 30 years lead to a slightly more efficient solar cell. It felt like trying to put out a forest fire with a water pistol. The urgency was killing me. I didn't see the world in terms of profit and loss. I saw it as a complex chemical equation that was dangerously out of balance. And I, Phineas Thorne, believed I was one of the few men on Earth smart enough to solve it. That was my original sin. Not greed, but an intellectual arrogance that bordered on a messianic complex. The breakthrough came to me not in the lab, but in a dream. It sounds cliché, I know, but it's the truth. I woke up at 3 a.m. with a chemical structure seared into my mind. It was a catalyst, a new process for refining rare earth metals, the lithium, the cobalt, the neodymium, that are the very lifeblood of the green revolution. They are the essential ingredients for every electric car battery, every wind turbine, every piece of technology that was meant to be our salvation. The problem was, extracting and refining them was a brutally slow, expensive, and filthy business. It was the dirty secret of clean energy. My process changed all of that. It was a chemical shortcut, a way to unlock these metals from their ore at 10 times the speed and a fraction of the cost. It was the philosopher's stone for the 21st century. I walked away from my university position without a second thought. I cashed out my pension, took out a second mortgage on my house, and founded Aegis Materials. For the first 2 years, it was just me and 2 graduate students in a rented warehouse that always smelled faintly of burnt toast. We worked 20-hour days, fueled by cheap coffee and the absolute unwavering conviction that we were on the cusp of changing the course of human history. When we finally perfected the process and had a working prototype, I didn't go to other chemists. I went straight to the venture capitalists on Sand Hill Road. The timing was perfect. It was the dawn of the EV boom. Every government on Earth was pouring subsidies into green technology. Aegis Materials wasn't just another startup. It was the key that would unlock the entire green transition. The investors didn't just see dollar signs, they saw the future. The first check was for 10 million. A year later, it was 100 million. Then came the IPO, and overnight I was a billionaire. My life became a blur of private jets, Davos conferences, and magazine covers. Time called me the planet's savior. Forbes put me on their cover with the headline, "The Man Who Made Green Gold." I wasn't just a CEO, I was a movement. The money to me was just a tool. It was fuel for the mission. It allowed me to build bigger, move faster, and accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels. I genuinely believed every single action I took was for the greater good of humanity. I felt like I was on the right side of history. It's a powerful, intoxicating feeling, more addictive than any drug or any amount of money. If you are out there right now building your own dream, or if you just believe that one great idea can truly change the world, for better or for worse, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments what city or country you're watching from. It's humbling to know how far these stories can travel. Within 5 years, Aegis Materials had built 3 massive refineries in the Nevada desert. We were the largest supplier of refined battery-grade metals in the world. We had brought thousands of high-paying tech jobs to a desolate region and were the poster child for the new American economy. I remember the day we inaugurated our largest facility, Helios Station. The desert sun beat down, glinting off a sea of 1 million solar panels that powered the entire plant. The governor was there, 2 U.S. senators, and a delegation of tech CEOs who had flown in from all over the world. They all stood behind me on a stage, a backdrop of gleaming steel and glass behind us. The air buzzed with optimism, with the feeling that we were truly at the dawn of a new age. I stepped up to the podium, looking out at the faces of my employees, the press, the politicians. I felt an incredible sense of vindication. I wasn't just a chemist in a dusty lab anymore. I was a titan, a force of nature. In my speech, I talked about our sacred mission, about our duty to future generations. I spoke of a world free from the tyranny of oil, a world powered by the clean, limitless energy of the sun. As I cut the ceremonial green ribbon, the crowd erupted in applause. In that moment, standing on that stage, I was more than a man. I was the future. I felt invincible, infallible, a conquering hero leading humanity into a brighter world. I believed with every fiber of my being that nothing I did could be wrong, because the mission itself was righteous. I had no idea, none at all, that deep beneath the pristine desert floor, the foundation of my empire and my salvation was already beginning to rot. My life at the peak was not one of vulgar excess. You won't find stories of me racing Lamborghinis through Monaco or hosting hedonistic parties on mega yachts. My arrogance was of a far more refined and perhaps more insidious variety. I saw myself as a philosopher king, a benevolent visionary who had transcended the grubby materialism of the old money titans. My wealth wasn't for pleasure. It was a testament to my virtue, a tool to sculpt a better world. I lived in a sprawling, multi-million-dollar compound in the hills overlooking the desert, but it wasn't a mansion. It was a biodome, a self-sustaining architectural marvel of recycled steel, smart glass, and geothermal cooling. It recycled its own water, grew its own food in hydroponic gardens, and was powered entirely by the next generation of solar technology from my own labs. I didn't own a home. I inhabited a living demonstration of the future I was building for everyone else. My private jet wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity of the mission. It whisked me from a climate summit in Geneva to a policy forum in Washington, D.C., and then to a board meeting in Tokyo, all in the same week. I justified the colossal carbon footprint with a simple, self-serving equation. The global good I was accomplishing far outweighed the personal cost. I was the indispensable man. The planet needed me, and it needed me to be mobile. My philanthropy was equally grandiose. I didn't just write checks, I established foundations, endowed university chairs in my name, and funded entire departments of environmental science. I was buying not just influence, but a legacy. I was ensuring that the story of our salvation would be written with Phineas Thorne as the protagonist. I surrounded myself with people who reflected this image back at me, academics, thought leaders, and politicians who praised my genius and reinforced my belief that I was operating on a higher plane of existence. But every grand structure has a hidden flaw in its foundation. For Aegis Materials, that flaw was buried 1,000 feet beneath the desert floor. My revolutionary process, the very chemical reaction that made me a billionaire, was like a magnificent beast with a secret venomous bite. It was brilliant at isolating the precious metals, but it left behind a truly monstrous byproduct, a hypersalinated, acidic leachate, thick as crude oil and laced with a cocktail of heavy metal catalysts. It was a chemical nightmare that couldn't simply be dumped or incinerated. In my frantic race to scale up, to meet the insatiable demand of the Green Revolution, I had made a fateful decision. We would not solve the waste problem, we would contain it. The solution was, on paper, an engineering marvel. We constructed colossal subterranean reservoirs, each the size of a football stadium, lined with a state-of-the-art, multi-layered polymer membrane. We would pump the toxic sludge into these giant underground tombs, sealing it away from the world. The public plan, the one I spoke of at conferences, was that this was a temporary measure. Our brilliant scientists, I would say with a confident smile, are already developing a second-stage process to neutralize this material and render it inert. Innovation never sleeps at Aegis. That was a lie. A noble lie, I told myself. The truth was, every attempt to neutralize the leachate had failed. It was more stable, more resilient, and more toxic than we had ever anticipated. So we just kept pumping it underground, adding more and more reservoirs, burying our problem deeper and deeper. The first warning didn't come from an environmental group or a government regulator. It came from my own people, from the heart of my own pristine empire. It arrived not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a quiet, unassuming email with a data attachment from my lead geological sciences team. The email was titled Sub-Reservoir Pressure Anomaly Analysis. I remember opening it in my glass-walled office overlooking the very desert we were filling with poison. The report was dense, full of seismic charts and chemical composition tables. But the conclusion, written in cold, objective language, was unmistakable. The pressure sensors inside several of the oldest reservoirs were showing readings that were slightly, but consistently, outside of operational parameters. Worse, deep earth soil sensors, miles away from the reservoirs themselves, had detected trace elements, parts per billion, of the specific catalysts used in our process. The report concluded that there was a high statistical probability of micro-permeation through the polymer linings. The tombs were leaking. Not a catastrophic breach, not a flood, but a slow, insidious seep. A chemical ghost bleeding out into the earth. I read the report twice, then a third time. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. This was not in the plan, this was an imperfection, a stain on my perfect vision. My first instinct was not fear for the environment or for the nearby towns. It was a surge of pure, unadulterated anger. An anger that this messy, inconvenient reality dared to contradict my elegant solution. I called an immediate meeting with the heads of engineering and geological sciences. I strode into the conference room, the report in my hand, and looked at the faces of the brilliant men and women I had personally hired. "Explain this to me," I said, my voice dangerously calm. They walked me through the data, their expressions a mixture of scientific concern and fear of my reaction. They recommended an immediate production halt at Helios Station to depressurize the affected reservoirs and begin exploratory work to find the source of the leaks. Their halting production for even a week would mean defaulting on a massive contract with a German automaker. It would send a shockwave through the stock market and raise questions we couldn't afford to answer. It would slow down the mission. And that was when the rationalization began. It was a subtle, seductive process. I stood before a whiteboard and began sketching out the larger equation. On this side, I said, drawing a large circle, we have the salvation of the global climate. Millions of electric vehicles on the road a decade ahead of schedule. Entire nations weaning themselves off coal. That is a tangible, measurable good of immense proportions. Then, I drew a tiny dot on the other side of the board. And on this side, we have a potential localized subterranean contamination issue measured in parts per billion in a geologically stable desert region hundreds of feet above the nearest aquifer. We are talking about an acceptable risk. I used my authority not just as a CEO, but as their intellectual superior. I was the PhD chemist. I was the visionary. I challenged their models, questioned their sensor calibrations, and framed their cautious scientific warnings as alarmism. The cost of progress is never zero, I told them, my voice filled with the weight of righteous conviction. History is not made by the timid. We will solve the containment issue. But we will not, under any circumstances, stop saving the world to fix a microscopic leak in our basement. They were silenced. Not because they were convinced, but because they were intimidated. I was the sun around which their careers orbited, and they were not prepared to fly into its fire. That evening I issued a single directive. The report on the pressure anomalies was to be classified as Level 5 Proprietary, restricted access to only 3 people in the entire company, myself included. We would create a special projects team, a skunk works, to address what I publicly rebranded as long-term containment optimization. It sounded proactive, innovative. It was a lie designed to bury a truth I wasn't willing to face. I had looked at the first real crack in the foundation of my empire, the first undeniable evidence that my perfect solution was flawed, and I chose not to fix it. I chose to paint over it. I told myself I was protecting the mission. But the truth is, I was protecting my own perfect, beautiful, world-saving idea from the ugly intrusion of reality. It was a choice that would cost me everything, and the people living just beyond the horizon, so much more. The weeks following that decision were a masterclass in compartmentalization. On the world stage, I was more visible than ever, a celebrated icon of progress. I gave a keynote address at a global technology summit in Seoul, sharing a stage with heads of state, my face projected onto screens the size of buildings. I spoke with impassioned certainty about the dawn of a new industrial revolution, one where economic growth and ecological responsibility were not just compatible but inseparable. I announced a new $10 billion investment to double the output of Helios Station, a move praised by market analysts as bold and visionary. I was the conductor of a global orchestra, playing a symphony of hope, and the applause was deafening. But back in Nevada, in a locked laboratory, in the deepest corner of the R&D wing, a different kind of music was being composed, a quiet, discordant dirge of failure. The long-term containment optimization team I had established was a sham, and I knew it. It was a well-funded, hermetically sealed unit of brilliant minds tasked with an impossible problem, a place where inconvenient data could be sent to die. They worked tirelessly, but every chemical path they explored led to a dead end. The toxic leachate was a masterpiece of malevolent stability. Every attempt to neutralize it either failed completely or produced even more volatile secondary compounds. Their weekly reports, encrypted and sent only to me, were a litany of frustration. Meanwhile, the micropermeation continued. The pressure in the subterranean tombs kept building. The chemical ghosts were seeping out, silent and persistent, moving through the deep earth with the slow, inexorable patience of geological time. The second warning didn't come from a computer model or a pressure sensor. It came in human form. Her name was Dr. Evelyn Reed. She was a young geochemist, barely 30, with a mind that was as sharp and unyielding as a diamond. She was a rising star in my geological sciences division, one of the few who had been privy to the original anomaly report before I had it buried. I had underestimated her. I had assumed that, like the others, she would be placated by my authority and the creation of the special projects team. But Evelyn was not built for quiet compliance. She was driven by an older, more stubborn force, the scientific method. The official explanation didn't align with the data, and that fact gnawed at her. She didn't follow the chain of command. She bypassed her department head, my VPs, everyone. She requested a direct meeting with me, citing a critical matter of operational integrity. My executive assistant tried to deflect her, to schedule her a month out. But Evelyn was relentless. She showed up at my corporate headquarters unannounced and waited in the lobby for 6 hours. Her sheer persistence was so unusual that it finally broke through my cocoon of handlers. Intrigued and slightly annoyed, I granted her 15 minutes. She walked into my cavernous office not with the deference of a subordinate, but with the focused intensity of a prosecutor. She wasn't intimidated by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the panoramic view of the desert, or the abstract art on the walls that was worth more than her house. She carried a single, thick binder. She laid it on my expansive obsidian desk and opened it. Inside were not just my company's internal charts, but public records, satellite thermal imaging, and hydrological maps of the entire region. She had been working on this in her own time, a secret, unauthorized investigation. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice steady and devoid of emotion, "the micropermeation is accelerating, but it's worse than we thought. Our models failed to account for a series of previously unmapped fissures in the limestone bedrock beneath Helios Station." She pointed to a topographical map overlaid with colored lines. "The leachate isn't just seeping, it's migrating. It's following these fissures, moving laterally, directly toward the aquifer that supplies the town of Silver Creek. Silver Creek was the small, unassuming town just over the ridge from the plant, home to most of my workforce. The place where our employees' children went to school, played in parks and drank water from the tap. My projections, she continued, flipping a page to a terrifying chart, show that at the current rate of leakage and migration, trace elements could reach the Silver Creek aquifer within 18 months. Not in parts per billion, sir, in parts per million. High enough to be a significant biological hazard. I stared at her, at the damning evidence laid out on my desk. Every part of my logical, scientific mind knew she was right. The data was sound, her methodology impeccable. But my ego, my mission, my entire world was built on the premise that this could not be happening. To accept her findings was to accept that I had not just made a mistake, but that I had committed an act of catastrophic negligence. My response was not one of inquiry, but of intellectual violence. I attacked her, not her data, but her. "Dr. Reed," I said, my voice dripping with condescension, "this is a bold and frankly reckless assertion. You are a geochemist. You are not a hydrological engineer, nor are you a materials scientist with an understanding of the complex polymer chemistry of our containment systems. You are drawing sensationalist conclusions from incomplete data sets." I stood up and walked around my desk, looming over her, using my physical presence to assert my dominance. "What you see as a crisis, I see as a manageable variable in a much larger, more important equation. You lack perspective. You are looking at a single tree, while I am responsible for the entire forest." She didn't flinch. "With all due respect, sir, the people of Silver Creek aren't a variable, and that forest you're managing is about to be poisoned at the roots." That was when my anger flared. Who was she, this brilliant, defiant girl, to question my vision? To imply that I, Phineas Thorne, the savior of the planet, would endanger human lives? It was an accusation so profound, it felt like blasphemy. I called an emergency meeting of my executive team with Evelyn present. It wasn't an investigation, it was an inquisition. I put her on trial. I brought in my division heads, men twice her age with decades of experience, and one by one, prompted by my leading questions, they picked apart her work. They called her methodology unorthodox, her conclusions premature. They were defending their own careers, of course, protecting themselves from the fallout of my initial bad decision. They threw their junior colleague under the bus to save themselves, and I handed them the keys to drive it. In 2 hours, I had systematically dismantled her credibility. I made her look like a hysterical, ambitious upstart trying to make a name for herself. The final blow was delivered with a feigned sense of paternal disappointment. "Dr. Reed," I concluded in front of everyone, "Aegis values bold thinking, but we cannot tolerate alarmism that threatens the stability of this company, and by extension the vital work we are doing for the world. I am ordering you to cease this unauthorized line of inquiry and hand over all your research to the Containment Optimization Team. They will review it in due course." It was a checkmate. I had cornered her, discredited her, and ordered her to be silent. I saw the look in her eyes change from defiance to a kind of hollowed-out resignation. She knew she had lost. She knew the truth would be buried. She said nothing. She simply nodded, gathered her binder from the table, and walked out of the room. The next morning, her letter of resignation was on my desk. I felt a surge of relief, the kind you feel after narrowly avoiding a disaster. I had silenced the alarm, I had neutralized the threat, I had protected the mission. I was so blinded by the light of my own righteous cause that I didn't realize I had just exiled the one person who was trying to save me from myself. I didn't see that in silencing her. I had made her desperate. And a desperate, brilliant mind is a very dangerous thing indeed. With Evelyn Reed's departure, a deceptive tranquility settled over Aegis Materials. It was the calm at the eye of a hurricane, a fragile peace I had purchased with intimidation and denial. Outwardly, the engine of my empire roared louder than ever. We broke ground on a new gigafactory in Europe, a move that sent our stock soaring to unprecedented heights. I was on a triumphant tour, accepting environmental awards in Stockholm and delivering speeches to adoring crowds of engineering students at MIT. I was the very embodiment of conscious capitalism, a benevolent titan forging a golden age. This public performance was intoxicating. It became my reality. The more the world celebrated my genius, the more I believed in my own infallibility. The memory of Evelyn's warnings faded, becoming a minor, discordant note in a grand symphony of success. But truth, I've learned, is not an argument you can win or a person you can dismiss. It's a physical force like gravity. You can ignore it for a while, but it will eventually pull you down. The first tremors of that descent began not in my boardroom, but in the quiet, dusty streets of Silver Creek. They were subtle at first, whispers on the wind. Stories began to circulate, a strange metallic taste in the tap water, an unusual number of household pets falling ill with kidney ailments. Then came the human cost. The town's only doctor, a weary man named Ben Carter who had served the community for 40 years, started noticing a statistical anomaly he couldn't explain. A cluster of rare autoimmune disorders, a spike in miscarriages among young women, an unsettling rise in neurological complaints in children. These weren't screaming headlines. They were quiet, personal tragedies accumulating in the town's medical files. Dr. Carter, being a man of science, began to look for a common denominator. He started sending water samples from his patients' homes to an independent lab in California, paying for the tests out of his own pocket. Simultaneously, the state's Environmental Protection Agency, prompted by a trickle of anonymous complaints, which I now know came from some of my own guilt-ridden scientists, began its own preliminary inquiries. They sent Aegis a formal yet routine request for our latest groundwater monitoring data from the perimeter of Helios Station. This was the moment of reckoning. The request landed on the desk of my chief operating officer, a man named Marcus Vance. Marcus was a loyal soldier, a brilliant logistical mind who had been with me since the early days. He was a man who understood process and execution, not chemistry. But he was also a man who lived in Silver Creek. His grandchildren played in the town park. When he saw the agency's request and cross-referenced it with the classified internal reports on the micro-permeation, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes for the first time. He came to my office, closing the door behind him. "Phineas," he said, his voice low, "we have a problem. The state EPA is asking for the well monitoring data, the real data." He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the room. "And I've been hearing things from town. My neighbor's son, he has a persistent tremor in his hands. He's only 8. People are getting sick." I felt the familiar cold knot tighten in my stomach, but this time it was laced with a new sensation, a surge of primal fear. The abstract intellectual problem of the manageable variable was suddenly staring back at me with the face of a sick child. The equation had changed, but my course of action was now dictated by a terrible momentum. Aegis was no longer just a company. It was a global behemoth. We had billions in corporate bonds coming due. We were leveraged to the hilt, our entire financial structure predicated on the promise of perpetual, uninterrupted growth. Admitting the truth now would not be just a public relations disaster. It would be an extinction-level event. It would trigger a catastrophic collapse of investor confidence, vaporize our stock, and lead to immediate bankruptcy. The mission, my mission, would die. The world would be denied its clean energy future because of this one localized flaw. This is the justification I built in my mind, a fortress of rationalization to protect myself from the monstrous reality of the choice I was about to make. I convinced myself that I was not acting to save my fortune, but to save my vision. It was a noble lie, a necessary evil to protect the greater good. I was a general in a war for the planet's survival, and sometimes a general must make sacrifices. Silver Creek was about to become a casualty of that war. "Marcus," I said, my voice a steady, unnerving calm, "we are 6 months, perhaps a year, away from a breakthrough on the neutralization technology. I have our best people working on it around the clock. We just need more time. If this gets out now, everything we've built, everything we're working toward will be for nothing." He looked at me, his face pale. "What are you suggesting we do, Phineas?" I walked to my desk and pulled up the schematics for our perimeter monitoring wells. They were state-of-the-art, with real-time digital sensors that fed data directly to our central servers. They were also, I knew, accessible and programmable. The sensors, I said, my voice barely a whisper. They require periodic recalibration. It's a standard procedure. Sometimes sensor drift can produce anomalous readings. I was giving him the language, the corporate speak, to make the unthinkable sound procedural. I want you to task a discrete team with a full system diagnostic and recalibration. Ensure that the data we provide to the EPA is within all acceptable federal and state guidelines. It's a matter of data integrity. Marcus stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. He understood exactly what I was ordering him to do. I wasn't telling him to dump poison into a river. I was telling him to commit a far more sophisticated crime, to manipulate the data, to use our advanced technology to tell a sophisticated lie, to falsify the official records that were the only line of defense for the people of Silver Creek. It was a deliberate, calculated act of fraud, designed to deceive regulators and conceal a public health crisis. He hesitated for a long moment, a war playing out behind his eyes. He was a good man trapped in a terrible position of loyalty. Finally, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't say a word. He just turned and walked out of my office, his shoulders slumped, looking like a man who had just sold his soul. I sat alone in the silence of my office, the desert sun streaming through the glass. There was no sense of triumph, no feeling of relief. There was only the cold, sterile certainty of a line crossed. I had moved beyond denial and into active conspiracy. It was no longer a mistake of arrogance committed in the heat of ambition. This was a decision made in cold blood. I signed the official quarterly report to the EPA myself, the one containing the sanitized, fraudulent data. My signature, once a symbol of innovation and integrity, was now the seal on a death warrant. I told myself it was to buy the time I needed to find a cure. But as I stared out at the distant ridge that separated my gleaming factory from the unsuspecting town, a dark thought crept into my mind, unbidden. What if there was no cure? What if I was just burying the bodies, hoping no one would ever think to dig them up? Before I tell you how the fortress of lies I constructed was finally breached and brought crashing down, I have a question for you. If you've journeyed this far with me, into the darkest corners of my ambition and self-deception, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And then I want you to comment below. What do you think is worse? A crime committed for pure naked greed, for the simple accumulation of wealth? Or a crime committed in the name of a noble cause, born from the conviction that you are doing what is right for the world? I've spent countless nights debating that very question in the silence of my own private exile. I'm curious to know your thoughts. The 6 months I bought with that act of fraud were the most surreal of my life. On the surface, it was business as usual. Aegis Materials posted a record-breaking quarter. I unveiled our new prototype for a solid-state battery that promised to double the range of electric vehicles, a breakthrough that landed me on the cover of Wired magazine, hailed once again as the man inventing the future. I moved through this world of accolades and stock options like a ghost, a hollow man playing a role. Every smile for the camera felt like a grimace. Every confident speech about our bright future felt like a eulogy I was delivering for my own soul. The lie was a living thing now, a parasite that had attached itself to me, and it was consuming me from the inside out. My nights were sleepless, filled with the phantom taste of metallic water and the faces of children I had never met. The catalyst for my downfall was not, in the end, a crusading journalist or a government investigation. It was something far more primal and unpredictable. The earth itself. Nature, the very system I claimed to be saving, rose up to pass its own judgment. That spring, an atmospheric river, a freak weather event of historic proportions, stalled over the Nevada desert. For 5 days and 5 nights, rain fell with a biblical intensity. It wasn't the gentle shower of a desert bloom. It was a deluge, a relentless, punishing torrent that turned the arid landscape into a sea of mud. The dry washes and arroyos became raging rivers, and the ground already compromised by our subterranean activities became saturated to the point of liquefaction. Deep beneath Helios Station, the immense pressure of the floodwater on the land above created a force that our engineers had never modeled. It was a geological hammer blow. On the fifth night of the storm, something deep within the earth gave way. It wasn't a single explosive event. It was a catastrophic structural failure. One of the oldest and most full subterranean reservoirs, its polymer lining already weakened by years of micropermeation and now squeezed by unimaginable hydrostatic pressure, ruptured. The tomb broke open. Millions of gallons of the toxic, acidic leachate, a concentrated poison that had been accumulating for over a decade, were injected directly into the water-saturated bedrock. It didn't seep anymore. It surged. It was a chemical tsunami, moving through the underground fissures that Evelyn Reed had warned me about. A plume of pure toxicity, flowing with terrifying speed directly into the Silver Creek aquifer. The immediate aftermath was apocalyptic. Within 48 hours, the water flowing from the taps in every home, school, and business in Silver Creek had turned a sickly, yellowish brown. It carried a sharp, acrid chemical odor that burned the nostrils. The first wave of illness was swift and brutal. Violent stomach cramps, dizziness, skin rashes that looked like chemical burns. The town's small hospital was overwhelmed in a single day. People were collapsing in the streets. It wasn't a hidden crisis anymore. It was a full-blown, undeniable catastrophe, unfolding in real time. The state declared a public health emergency. The National Guard was called in to distribute bottled water. Hazmat teams in full protective gear swarmed the town, their presence turning a place of quiet community into a scene from a disaster movie. And the finger of suspicion pointed immediately and unequivocally in one direction, at the gleaming industrial complex on the hill. That was when the second hammer fell. Dr. Evelyn Reed, who had vanished into academic obscurity after I had forced her out, reappeared. She hadn't been idle. She had spent the last 2 years quietly feeding her original data and her well-founded suspicions to a small, tenacious team of investigative journalists. They had been building a case, brick by painstaking brick, but had lacked the definitive proof: the smoking gun. The disaster in Silver Creek was the gunshot. Evelyn went public. She appeared on national television, not as a discredited former employee, but as a Cassandra whose prophecies had come horrifically true. She laid out the science with calm, irrefutable clarity. She presented the internal documents she had copied before she left, showing our knowledge of the initial leaks. She explained exactly how the company could have, and should have, acted to prevent the disaster. Her testimony blew the doors off my carefully constructed fortress of lies. Federal investigators from the EPA and the FBI descended on Aegis headquarters with warrants that gave them access to everything. They seized our servers, our lab notes, our emails. The fraudulent sensor data I had ordered was discovered in less than a day. The digital breadcrumbs left by the recalibration team were laughably easy for the FBI's cybercrime unit to follow. The lie was not only exposed, it was laid bare in all its cynical criminal detail. The financial collapse was instantaneous and absolute. Trading of Aegis stock was halted on the New York Stock Exchange, but it was a mere formality. The company was already worthless. Our credit lines were frozen. Our largest clients, the global automakers and tech giants who had once paraded me as a visionary partner, severed all ties in a series of brutal press releases, condemning Aegis and desperately trying to distance themselves from my toxicity. The $4 billion empire I had built evaporated in 72 hours. It didn't just decline, it ceased to exist, leaving behind a crater of debt and a legacy of poison. My own fall was just as swift. I watched the news from my biodome, a prisoner in my own sterile paradise, as my face became the international symbol of corporate malfeasance. I was no longer the planet's savior. I was the poison profiteer. I was forced to resign as CEO in a humiliating 2-sentence statement. The board, the same men and women who had profited from my ambition, turned on me with the savagery of a cornered animal. They threw me to the wolves to save their own skins. But the worst was yet to come. The government didn't just want my company, they wanted me. A class action lawsuit of unprecedented scale was filed on behalf of every resident of Silver Creek. The Department of Justice unsealed a multi-count federal indictment against me personally. Conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, and a litany of charges under the Clean Water Act. The fines levied against the now bankrupt shell of my company were astronomical, in the billions, designed to fund the cleanup of the aquifer, a task that engineers estimated could take a century. The courts pierced the corporate veil, and every asset I owned, my home, my stocks, my art collection, my bank accounts, was frozen and seized. I went from being a multi-billionaire to having less than $1,000 to my name in the space of a week. The day the federal marshals came to my door to arrest me, I felt not shock but a strange, hollow sense of finality. The symphony was over. The lie had finally collapsed under its own weight, and I was buried in the rubble. The legal battle was a formality, a public execution staged in slow motion. I didn't have the resources to fight, nor did I have the will. What defense could I possibly offer? My signature was on the falsified reports. My emails detailed the cover-up. I had confessed to my COO. The trial was short. In the end, my high-priced lawyers, paid for by what little remained of a director's insurance policy, managed to negotiate a deal. It was a trade, my freedom for my testimony. I avoided a long prison sentence largely due to my age and my full unvarnished cooperation in the sprawling investigation that followed. I became the government's star witness in the case against the company I had founded, detailing every decision, every shortcut, every lie. In exchange for this ultimate act of corporate betrayal, I was sentenced to house arrest, community service, and ordered to pay restitution fines so colossal that they were purely symbolic. I was, for all intents and purposes, condemned to a life of perpetual debt. My life after the fall was not a climb back to redemption. It was a descent into absolute anonymity. I was stripped of everything that had once defined me. The biodome was seized and sold at auction. The foundations I had created were dissolved, my name chiseled off university buildings like that of a fallen tyrant. I was excommunicated from the scientific community I once led. My friends, the powerful men and women who had once filled my evenings with praise and laughter, vanished as if they had never existed. I was a pariah, a walking ghost haunted by the headlines that chronicled the ongoing health crisis in Silver Creek, a crisis that was now my only tangible legacy. With the pittance the court allowed me to keep for basic living expenses, I retreated. I bought a small, neglected cabin on a few acres of wooded land, hundreds of miles from the desert that held the ruins of my empire. It was a place where no one knew my name or my face. My new life was an echo, an ironic inversion of the one I had preached. I had championed a world of grand, sweeping technological solutions, and now I lived a life of deliberate, humble simplicity. I grew my own vegetables not as a lifestyle choice, but because I couldn't afford to buy them. I chopped my own wood for heat. And in a final bitter twist of fate, I powered the few electronics I owned. A small radio, a laptop for court-mandated check-ins, and this old camera with a tiny, salvaged solar panel. The very technology I had sought to empower the world with now provided the meager spark for my own isolated existence. The silence of this new life was deafening at first. For years, my world had been a cacophony of ringing phones, urgent meetings, and the constant hum of my own importance. Here the only sounds were the wind in the pines and the frantic beating of my own heart. In that crushing solitude, there was nowhere left to run from myself. Stripped of wealth, status, and the grand mission that had served as my armor, I was forced to confront the man I had become. I replayed every decision, every rationalization, every moment I chose the easier, more expedient lie over the harder, more honorable truth. I had spent my entire life believing I was a man of ideas, a man of science. But when my ideals were put to the ultimate test, when they collided with the messy, inconvenient reality of a leaking reservoir, I had failed utterly. I had sacrificed real people on the altar of an abstract principle. I had told myself I was protecting the future of the planet, but in reality, I was protecting my own ego. I couldn't bear the thought that my perfect, world-saving idea was flawed. My pride was a more powerful motivator than my morality. The catastrophe wasn't caused by a chemical leak. It was caused by a soul leak, a slow, progressive corrosion of my own integrity. The lesson that emerged from that painful self-examination was as simple as it was devastating. I had believed that the ends justified the means. I learned in the most brutal way imaginable that the means are all we truly have. The process, the choices we make moment by moment, the integrity with which we act when no one is watching. That is the only thing that defines us. You cannot build a clean future on a foundation of poison and deceit. The structure will inevitably collapse because the foundation is a lie. My arrogance was not in wanting to save the world. It was in believing that I, and I alone, was qualified to decide the price. My life now is a quiet penance. I spend my days trying to cultivate in this small patch of earth the honesty and humility I failed to cultivate in myself. I have not reconciled with the world. I neither expect nor deserve its forgiveness. My only connections are the letters I write. I write to the civic leaders of Silver Creek, offering what little knowledge I have to aid in their cleanup and recovery efforts. Most of my letters go unanswered. I also write to Evelyn Reed, not to ask for forgiveness, but to thank her, to acknowledge her courage and her integrity, the very qualities I lacked. She has never written back. I don't blame her. So I sit here, on this porch, with this tiny panel, turning sunlight into the power I need to tell you this story. I didn't lose my fortune because I was greedy or because I made a bad bet. I lost it because I believed my noble intentions placed me above the simple, ancient rules of right and wrong. I thought I was a god, reshaping the world in my own image. Now I know I am just a man, a deeply flawed man who must live with the consequences of his choices. The true wealth, the only kind that lasts, isn't in your bank account or your stock portfolio. It's in the clarity of your conscience. It's in being able to look at your reflection and not see a monster. By that measure, I died a pauper long before I ever lost a dime. If my story has made you think, if it has resonated with you in any way, I ask you to do one last thing for me. Share it. Share it with anyone who believes that a noble goal is an excuse to cut corners. Share it with anyone who thinks their great vision entitles them to a different set of rules. And finally, please comment with the most important lesson you've ever learned about the difference between good intentions and right actions. Your stories are now a part of mine. Thank you for listening.